It's exactly 14 minutes past 1 p.m. It's a Tuesday afternoon. And so, it's time for the Executive Lounge, the show that brings you thought leaders from around the world, right here at home, and people who are just doing great stuff and cool stuff that we can all learn from. We're in the month of May already, and guess what? We're almost halfway through the month. I have a feeling this year has something to do with Usain Bolt or the other way around, because it was just January a few days ago. Anyway, let's dive into the conversation and let me introduce who my guest is today. We're going to be talking about the potential for Ghana's real estate market, learnings from around the world, how others have done it, and if indeed we can leapfrog like has been said in other sectors. Could there be leapfrogging in the infrastructure and property market? My guest serves as president of Capital Value and Income Corporation. He's also a senior member, director at Ontario Infrastructure Ontario. It's an organization that handles all of the major government projects in the city of Ontario, in Canada. He's also the executive, vice president for corporate, or served rather, as executive vice president, corporate development and investment of Oxford Property Group since 2005. He led the global investment team responsible for acquisitions, dispositions, and new business development. Served also as an advisor at Green Sky Capital Incorporated, the investment arm of that organization. Well over 20 years of experience in real estate and investment management and private equity experience. He graduated with a bachelor's in architecture from McGill University, then went on to get a Master of Science degree in real estate from MIT, and then another degree, an MBA in management from Wharton Business School of Business. He's been all over, spent some time in the States. He's also had oversight responsibility for understanding and working in the Middle East markets as well. And so he's well versed in emerging market trends. And so today we're going to be plundering his fine brain for his experience. But you're welcome to Ghana, and welcome to the Executive Lounge, Chris.
Thank you, sure. A pleasure to be here.
Yeah. Let's dive straight into this. Quite a lot of people seem to think that, Africa is the last frontier. Africa has an opportunity to leapfrog. We look around the world, advanced and developed economies, and we see, the skyscrapers, and we see the modern cities and the underground subways and all of these things, and we dream about them. Mm-hmm. Is this just one of those things people say to placate the developing world, or do you believe that we truly can leapfrog?
I think there's a real opportunity here to move forward. The real estate markets in general, and even some of the larger countries around the world, have only matured over the course of the last 20 or 30 years. So there's real room for opportunity. And for a country like Ghana, there's an opportunity to take some of the technologies that have been developed, the processes that have been developed, the regulatory environments that have been developed, all of which would help accelerate the real estate marketplace locally. And, fundamentally, real estate is one of the bedrocks in terms of value creation and wealth creation. So for a nation like Ghana, I think there's real opportunity here to take learnings from other countries, other environments, and then apply them locally. So the idea of leapfrogging and taking advantage of developments in other countries, I think, is very real.
When you look around you, from your first impressions when you arrived, what gives you hope as someone who's advised several groups on where to put money?
Sure.
What gives you hope about Ghana?
Yeah, and I will say this is very much an exploratory trip for me, so I'm very pleased to be here. This is actually my first trip to Ghana, so my impressions are very new and very real in terms of just being in the environment, looking around, walking around, meeting with people. I'm advising a local group here called Altos, which is popularly known as Golden Mainland in the real estate and infrastructure space. But what I would say is I'm very pleased with my first impressions. Very much an optimistic environment, which I think is important. Everyone I meet has a very positive outlook for the future, for their own prospects as well as for company prospects, for investment, for growth. Obviously, this is a high growth market, so having the wind at your back is always a positive thing. So there's lots of room and lots of opportunity for development, for growth, for value creation, as I've said. So my initial impressions is that very stable environment, very positive environment, good, macroeconomic stability relative to, the rest of the continent. And I think all of those things speak very favorably for the future.
Let's learn a little more about the economies you've worked in. The structure of these economies as such that even a guy who's working and this is not to say it's an inferior work, but a factory line worker earning just above minimum wage has a chance or a hope of even at some point being able to get onto the property ladder. So,
Right.
Yeah. The structure of our economy is different. You've got quite a small percentage of the population, the working population, within the formal sector, which is a requirement for property finance.
That's right.
What kind of changes have you seen made elsewhere to make the property market accessible to people who otherwise wouldn't find themselves in that bracket?
Right. So I think it's very important. I think, obviously, as you mentioned, getting on the property ladder is a real goal for people all around the world, and it is a step to creating long-term wealth, generational wealth. And in most markets, as the economies grow and populations expand and we modernize, that's a very favorable framework for real estate. So real estate will tend to increase in value over time. And as they say, there's only so much real estate in a local market, so it's an irreplaceable asset. So it's very important. I think in terms of the structural framework for getting on the property ladder, I think is geared towards having, number one, a stable economy with good processes in terms of things like income verification, a financing market that's accessible to an average citizen in terms of being able to get financing. Clearly, the hurdle that most people face is aggregating that initial deposit, that down payment for a piece of property, whether it's land or a home or an apartment. So getting that deposit is clearly the most important challenge, and that just takes time. But then once you have that, you need to be able to basically look at the local markets, whether it's through government intervention or private intervention, to be able to finance a property. So developing, both in the private sector and with the support of the government, an active financing and mortgage market, I think, is critically important, because in many economies, trying to basically acquire real estate all cash is a very formidable undertaking, because real estate tends to be, relative to most people's incomes, and that's true around the world, is a very large asset, and it's a very important asset. So having a financing framework, I think, is very much assistive to moving forward in terms of the property market. And that has a ripple effect, because that will generate more development, which creates more jobs, which creates the more use of materials and so on. So that it's an economic stimulus, and that has a very positive cycle, which creates more jobs, creates more wealth, and enables people to then earn more so that they can actually move forward and acquire their own home, which is typically the first piece of real estate that most people aspire to own, is their home.
Right. If you just tuned in, it's 23 minutes past 1. This is the Executive Lounge with me, Inshira Addo. My guest is Christopher Vucinas, and he is a property finance and investment expert with more than 2 decades of experience. Worked in the United States, currently in Canada. He's also had oversight and dealings across quite a number of emerging markets, including the Middle East. And he's on an exploratory mission to Ghana, and caught him and thought I should plunder his expertise and his fine brain for a bit. You know, you mentioned government in there, and let me just give you a little interesting context about Ghana. We operate a free market economy. The dominant political parties over the last 2 decades that have been at the helm of government have done a mix of social interventions. There's been talk of let's do some affordable housing so people, you know, with low income can get on the property ladder, which is a great idea. But across the world, would you say that the concept where government pretty much almost creates a social space with interventions like that has been a sustainable way to grow the infrastructure or close the gap, property gap?
Yeah, I would almost say it's a necessity to have a very efficient and positive commercial real estate marketplace. That's some kind of government framework in terms of norms, rules, laws, regulation is critically important to that. So the more, and again, that's not to take away from a free market, because of course we all support free market economies. But in terms of real estate, I think it is important that the government provide a framework, first and foremost, a stable macroeconomic environment in which to operate. Of course, a rule of law so that there are proper contracts and rules and regulations in terms of how to transact in the real estate space. But then again, certain regulatory things like having the ability to have security around title on a property so that when you acquire a piece of property, you can take comfort in knowing that you are actually the one and the only owner of that property. So in many jurisdictions, the title process or title registration process is either a framework that was established by the government or in fact controlled by the government. And that's critically important to enable confidence in a properly functioning real estate marketplace. So there is a role for government, and that's not to say that it should supplant a free market economy, but it should provide a framework within which one can operate.
Interesting. You know, at the core of what I've just heard you say, in my estimation, is that government has a critical role to play. But that role is not necessarily direct intervention in the market.
That's
It's
right.
rather creating the space within which the other players can work together.
That's right.
But in other places where, say, and I don't know the model, and the one that comes to mind easily is the UK, where there's social housing. Of course, they have operated a social, agenda for a very long time. We have a slightly different model. I think it's a hybrid of what works and at a given point in time. But for an emerging economy, quite often, you know, the tendency is for government to think about providing the basics in the Maslow hierarchy to the people first. And so there's the tendency to want to spend money on these things. Would you propose that if you were advising my government in my utopic world to spend, or to rather just create a framework within which the factors of economy can work together?
So I think it's a hybrid of both of those things. So I think the government clearly does have a role to play in terms of establishing a proper framework for managing transactions, for financing transactions, for, again, as I said, registering title and all those kinds of things. But at the same time, like all governments around the world, there is a social aspect to social good in terms of the government. So even in a free market economy like Canada, for a developer to get their permits and approvals to build a new, whether it could be a condominium tower, an office tower, or a retail shopping mall or whatever, in most instances the government will require a certain percentage to be allocated, let's say in the case of Toronto, to affordable housing. And so, you might think that that's an unfair intervention in terms of a free market economy, but in other ways, that is a positive benefit for the economy. It's a positive benefit in terms of the people. And, I would say smart developers recognize the value of that, and they often get better permits and better approvals if they cooperate and deliver affordable housing, which is clearly a social need. And I think without government intervention, like many, profit-driven organizations, which is what many developers are for the most part, they might not deliver that affordable housing, right? So I think there is a role to be played in terms of those kinds of things, which are good for the economy and good for the market as a whole.
Interesting thoughts. See, we've talked a bit about government, so I'd like us to segue into a concept that's lately talked, about a lot in our part of the world, which is public-private partnerships. And you work with Infrastructure Ontario. I'm guessing this is a municipal or a city, a government agency. Provincial
Yes.
agency. All right. So how does it work?
So we do use public-private partnerships, both for real estate as well as large-scale infrastructure projects like building subways, hospitals, railroads, those kinds of things. And basically what it does is it takes the risk away. So there's a balancing of risk and reward. And it shifts risk to the private sector. And it allows the government that is primarily financing these projects to have a certainty of outcome, both in terms of the overall cost as well as the time frame for delivery. And so the way that that's done is the payment model is shifted such that the bulk of the payment doesn't occur until after a project is delivered on time and on budget. So clearly the risk goes to the property developer, the contractor, the constructor. Could be a highway, could be a hospital, as I said, or even an office building. And then they can finance off of the back of the government credit. So they may not need the payments, the milestone payments over the course of construction. Typically, we will pay anywhere from, let's say, 30 to 50% of the cost during the construction period, but the bulk of the payments are made post delivery. So it shifts risk and it gives certainty to the government in terms of the completion of the project. And that works very well, and governments tend to have very good credit, and therefore the proponent, the developer, the builder can indirectly finance off of that government obligation to fund upon completion, or in many cases to fund over time, over the life cycle of that project. So it works very well. It lowers the overall costs, and again, it transfers the risk to the builder so that there's a certainty of outcome.
I don't know how credit ratings work for countries, nation states, but I kind of guess it works just like individual credit rating, right?
That's
so
right.
Ghana is currently sitting around a B minus, which is close to very good.
Yeah.
Now, with that box ticked, would you say, how would you describe your experience across emerging markets that sit in the space that Ghana sits, with good credit rating, stable economy, rule of law, and a massive infrastructure gap? How well have PPPs helped them? And how, if not done well, what they could have done differently?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's two views on the PPP model. I do think it works very well, and you do need to have a baseline credit rating for it to work, of course, and I think Ghana's credit rating would be satisfactory from that perspective. And so at a minimum, if you have that credit rating, then it's something that can be taken advantage of and that can be leveraged to reduce the overall cost of a project. And so for I think it's a trade-off. I think in nations where they still don't have that credit rating, that could be underwritten, and that provides a certain comfort level to the private sector as well as the banks, because clearly, many of the banks or the large sovereign wealth funds are the ones who are providing the equity for these projects. Then it tends to be more of a traditional delivery model, which, like with the private sector, you pay as you go, and there are milestone payments that need to get done. I think if you have the baseline of a reasonably solid credit rating, then the 3P model works very well. If you don't have the credit rating, then what happens is the cost of that model's delivery actually increases incremental because of the underlying lack of credit, let's say. So it wouldn't be a model that would work very well unless you had a baseline credit rating that made sense.
Okay. I'd like to borrow your thoughts on, your experiences from, and I know that in Canada you didn't really feel much of the subprime meltdown, but I would like, I'm sure you would have some insights on that. But before then, I would love to understand what you would say was your experience working in the Middle East. Largely because if you take Bahrain, Dubai, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, who are doing quite well, they still are considered emerging markets in a sense. But if we put ourselves as a country on the scale with these emerging markets, then there's a bit of a gap, or well, there is a gap.
Yeah.
Um, what are the learnings from these markets? How have they been able to steadily grow their infrastructure portfolio and provide, social good?
Yeah, I mean, just to be clear, most of my experience was investing capital abroad, outside of the Middle East, but Middle Eastern capital. But essentially, what's happened with a lot of these nations, they've developed sovereign wealth funds, so government-sponsored wealth funds that are being used to drive infrastructure and real estate in their local economy. So again, very similar to the Ontario model, whether it's building schools, building hospitals, in some cases in the Middle East, building entire cities. So it really is, because of the scale of these investments, it does require governmental intervention and policy, where there's a real willingness to do this, because it actually helps, whether it's a region, a nation, move to the next level and advance, and obviously deliver better services to its people, which is always a good thing.
You mentioned that your experience mostly was investing outside of the
Yes.
Middle East. So you have the knack of pointing money where it should go.
Yeah.
What do you look for in a destination for investment?
So, I mean, first and foremost, I would say a pro-business economy, where there's a willingness to transact, where there's a deep marketplace in terms of available counterparties on a transaction. Obviously, a stable macroeconomic environment makes total sense. Growth is an important factor. So if you can invest in a market that's growing, and that could be a regional market, it could be a city, or it could be a country as a whole, if there's general growth, that's a good thing, and that tends to be very good for real estate as well, and that's true across all of the sectors, whether it's retail, residential, commercial, office. So high growth markets obviously favor that, and then an established financing market, because again, most sophisticated real estate investors will leverage their equity with debt. So those, I would say, are the critical factors that would be important.
Super stuff. Okay, 36 minutes past 1. You're listening to the Executive Lounge, and I'm having a chat with investment and finance, property investment and finance expert Christopher Vucinas. And if you have some questions, you can send them via WhatsApp or Telegram. It's 0244 340 437, or you can tweet at me at GHRainmaker or hashtag Executive Lounge, and I will share your thoughts or your questions with Christopher, who I'm sure will have more than enough joy answering them for you. We've looked at the concept of public-private partnerships for emerging economies, and according to Chris, it's a good thing, and countries like Ghana are a great place to attract these. Now, you may not know this, but in Ghana, there's a certain cynicism attached to public-private partnerships. I don't know whether it's a lack of understanding of the concept, or maybe in the attempt to do things like this, it's not gone the way the majority of the people would appreciate. How, beyond all these, macro stuff, stability, a good economy, high growth potential, that would underscore why money should go into a destination for PPPs. What else do you feel ought to be done more on the on the government side? What has happened in other places that you've seen PPPs work well?
Yeah. So if I use Infrastructure Ontario as an example, it's a very large, very sophisticated company that oversees all of the 3P projects in Ontario. And that company has about 550 employees, so it's a very large company. We have very, very deep systems in terms of how we issue a request for a proposal, how we evaluate those proposals, highly technical, highly skilled professionals internally that bring that skill and that experience to bear. So, I mean, you have to have that level of infrastructure, that level of discipline, that level of intensity, such that it's clearly understood what's being bargained for. There has to be a high degree of governance, so the processes are very transparent, they're very regulated, you know, in terms of timelines, submissions, what needs to be submission, the level of information, all those kinds of things, as well as due diligence on the counterparties, who's making the submissions, how deep are their teams, what kind of track records do they have, what kind of financial credit do they have. So again, once you have that framework, and it's done, and again, this is on the side of the government, such that the proposals are clearly evaluated, and then ultimately the best decision is made in terms of the cost, the time frame, and the proponents. Because some of these projects are very long term. They could be 10 years, 20 years. We've had projects on the rail side that are 30, 35-year build-outs in terms of creating entire rail networks across the province. So in that regard, you have to be very careful about how you award those contracts, and again, because it's government money and and they tend to be very large-scale projects, they have to be very well governed and very transparent. So we're held to a very high standard, but again, it's a very, very professionally managed and disciplined process, and I think that's critically important to success of a 3P.
Interesting points you raise on how it's professionally. I mean, the expression deep systems. So you have people with technical know-how to ensure that project specifications are properly done.
That's right.
Because if you don't specify properly, then your outcome wouldn't be what you expected.
That's exactly right.
And then also in terms of the awarding of the contracts and choosing the final supplier, it's important that the transparency is critical. You know, that you're choosing the right person based on the criteria you've set, and that they're the ones that satisfy the most of it. If I asked you to look into a crystal ball and kind of hazard where Ghana or the sub-region, the West African sub-region's potential lies in infrastructure, housing, and social infrastructure and economic infrastructure, where would you say your low-hanging fruits will lie?
So I think on the real estate side, you know, based on my early observations here, I think there's a real need for residential development, and you know, in the mid to affordable housing market where there's a real need, where there's a real demand. So it's a question of how do you access that demand and how do you create an environment where it's possible to execute and possible for locals to acquire property, and in particular their own home. So I think there's an economic benefit to that, but there's also a very huge social benefit to that. So I see that as a real opportunity here. And then on the infrastructure side, you know, infrastructure tends to be a very strong economic stimulus. So whether it's in establishing you know, very efficient road networks, transit networks, hospitals, you know, again with a social aspect to it, which again leads to a better standard of living, which then, you know, has its own economic benefits and ripple effects. I think those are also areas and opportunities for growth.
To borrow and finance infrastructure versus PPPs, what's your take?
So, I mean, that's a very traditional model, you know, which is much, you know, much more akin to how a real estate transaction would work. You underwrite a transaction, you fund a certain proportion of it as equity, and then you borrow against the remainder. And so I think in infrastructure, there are those that believe that process, which is a much more market-oriented process, and some do believe that because of market forces, the overall cost of that type of commercial transaction leads to lower cost infrastructure. But then I think what's not as well understood is the risks, the inherent risks in that transaction. So where a P3 can balance the risk in terms of the public and private sector, a traditional transaction may not. And I think they work well at a smaller scale. But the moment you start to get into larger scale, longer term products, I think flipping into a more traditional PPP structure makes more sense.
Right. Fantastic stuff. 44 minutes past 1. This is the Executive Lounge with me in Sharado. My guest is Christopher Vucinas. He's a property finance and investment expert. He's pointed many groups in the right direction where to invest their money, and currently on an exploratory trip to Ghana. Caught up with him and plundering his fine brain. So if you have some questions of your own, do send them through via WhatsApp on 0244-340-437. Same number works on Telegram. You can also tweet at Joy997 or mention me in your tweet at GHRainmaker. And we'll be happy to answer those questions for you. End users make shareholders happy, because the essence of any business venture is to achieve some level of profitability. Would you believe that for an economy such as Ghana or a lot of emerging economies, the number of people you need to sustainably grow a real estate market is absent?
No, I wouldn't say that. I think, there are active real estate markets in very small economies and regional economies, villages around the world, those kinds of things. So I think it's about having the right product, it's about affordability, and it's about managing risk. So I think that I wouldn't see that as a challenge within Ghana. I think there's enough, big enough population, established economic system, and growth, which I said earlier is critically important. So there's definitely a positive foundation here for real estate and infrastructure.
All right. So I jumped into just learning about what you've done all this while. Let's get to know you a little bit. Of course, you have 2 degrees. You have an MBA, and then you have real estate
Right.
from MIT, and then you did architecture. Seems you kind of decided where you wanted to go very early on. How come?
Yeah, you know what? It was very much driven by market forces. My undergraduate degree, as you mentioned, was in architecture. When I graduated, the real estate markets were in a very bad cycle in Canada.
Mm-hmm.
I did work for a number of years as an architect, but it was a very difficult time. So that's the other aspect of real estate around the world. It tends to be a very cyclical market. So there are up times and down times. I happened to graduate at a downtime, and then decided that it was right to go back to school and get an education, focus more on, initially my thought was property development. And then when I graduated from MIT's real estate program, all of the property developers in Canada and the United States were going bankrupt. Again, it went from bad to worse. And almost by accident, I would say, my career shifted more onto the investment side of the real estate business as opposed to the design build side. And that just, went from one opportunity to another, and then after a number of years I decided that was where I wanted to focus.
I did say that I was going to talk to you about the subprime meltdown, and just when you talked about the cyclical nature of the real estate business brought me back to that. So the boom and the bust, everyone seems to think, or quite a number of people do think, that one, property prices are very high in Ghana for an emerging market, and also that maybe we're due for some kind of leveling out at some point. I don't know how much data you've chewed on this market, but where would you say we are in the cycle?
So, in terms of, again, my early explorations into the market, I think primarily focused on the residential side. I don't see as big a disconnect as one has seen in other markets around the world. So I wouldn't say necessarily that there's a bubble yet.
Okay.
Obviously, affordability is critically important, as I said earlier, and establishing some kind of mortgage market, with a structured framework. So, for example, in Canada, we didn't suffer as much as other countries around the world because we have a very tight and very controlled banking system. So the banks are very conservative in lending and in mortgage lending. So when the crisis hit around the world, the average Canadian homeowner did not see themselves with, super large mortgages that they could not afford, right? So I think within reason, keeping and maturing that market will allow people to have affordability to buy, and then it's a question of, what happens to prices, right? But I think right now, the amount of supply that it matches basically a significant amount of demand, and the time required to deliver the real estate, whether it's through permitting and building permits and actual construction, creates a kind of natural balance. Now that might change over time, but right now I haven't seen it as an overly inflated market.
That's nice to know that, so a very well-regulated banking sector can ease the shock of what we all witnessed during the subprime meltdown. And you think that we have an economy that we should be optimistic about in terms of the future prospects of the real estate market, especially in the home, the residential sector. That said, I'd like to explore with you two things. You talked about, so for people, and again focusing more on the end user, the end user's income verification and all of this thing. We're currently undergoing a process where we're registering, Ghanaians, creating a solid database for people to be easily verified where they live and all of these things. How has the verification process aided in growing the residential property market in some of the advanced markets you've worked in?
So two ways. One, the absence of that market has often created crises, right? And even in an advanced or sophisticated market like the United States, that was a big driver of the residential meltdown during the global financial crisis, in the sense that you had a lot of banks that were competing, for that mortgage business, and they had lax standards in terms of income verification and those kinds of things. So people were borrowing more than they could really afford. And so when the markets pulled back, it created a crisis, right? So again, having that framework provides a solid foundation such that things remain in balance. So you never want to get them out of balance. So it creates a framework whereby it facilitates the ability to finance one's home. And at the same time, it creates a nice balance so that things don't get overheated or get out of control, both in terms of values, in terms of debt service, those kinds of things. Ultimately, it comes down to affordability, being able to afford one's mortgage, being able to afford one's home, however big or small that might be.
In terms of, so I once had a chat with a gentleman who I think he runs the PPP for the SADC region, and I asked him what he thought the low-hanging fruits were for an investor, an entrepreneur who wants to enter Ghana and do some good business. And he mentioned 3 areas. And I'd like to put that same question to you. What sectors would you say would be prime areas for money to go into today that are low-hanging, that you can do good PPPs and good returns maybe in the next 10 years?
Yeah, I think they're all related. So obviously I think in terms of real estate, as I've said earlier, the housing market, so being able to deliver, affordable housing to the marketplace and do it in a way that delivers an appropriate level of quality and usability. So, really solid, good quality homes into the marketplace. And then on the other side, in terms of civil engineering works, whether it's, access, road works, I have visited some real estate sites, as I mentioned earlier. I'm by no means an expert on Ghana. This is my first trip, but I have managed to visit a number of real estate developments that are currently underway, residential developments that are doing well, but they're difficult to get to, right? So the more one can establish an efficient and an easy-to-use road framework, and that includes everything from having proper drainage, access to power, obviously road access, those kinds of things. I think those go hand in hand, so I would say that's another area or opportunity for growth. And on a totally different sector, different segment, just in terms of where I might have seen some opportunity in other markets, and I think there could be some parallels here, is in the healthcare and education space as well. So I think as one develops an economy, as one improves the standard of living, as one is more able to own and enjoy their own home, then other things like access to education, access to good quality healthcare become critically important. So it's part of the same path of prosperity, if you will. And so I think they're all related.
Would you include the tourism subsector in this list of places that could be financed well?
I think in a lot of countries around the world, obviously tourism plays a very important role. I'm by no means a tourist expert, but clearly that is a way of obviously bringing foreign capital into a market. I'm of Greek heritage, and obviously tourism in Greece is such an important aspect, and notwithstanding some macroeconomic issues that Greece has had over the last number of years, the tourism industry has boomed, and that has helped sustain sort of almost on a counter-cyclical basis, the Greek economy and the Greek people. So I'm not an expert on tourism, but yes, I think if you can develop an active tourist sector, that's critically important.
But incidentally, it is still linked to quite a number of the things you mentioned. I mean, access to power, access to clean environment, good roads. There's no point wanting to go somewhere if you're not going to travel on a good road.
Yeah, and one thing I would say, I mentioned to my colleagues when I arrived, and again, this is my first trip to Ghana, and arrived at the Accra airport. I was very impressed by the airport. The efficiency, the design, the layout, the cleanliness, the ease of moving through the airport. So that's a good first impression as well, whether you're a property investor or a tourist, right? So I've been to many other much larger countries where you arrive and it's absolute chaos, right?
Wow. Okay. So that's a plus point for us.
Yeah, I think so.
How long did that feeling last?
I honestly, I've had a very positive feeling from the time I arrived. So, I came here with sort of an open point of view, and it's just been very positive.
Wow. Well, it's unfortunate we don't have too much time to carry on this conversation, because I would definitely like to learn more from you. It's been a wonderful time, learning about what the perspective of someone who's just visiting Ghana for the first time, with all your experience, where you think we truly have potential. For me, I've got 5 takeouts from each conversation, and for me, the first thing is the importance of systems. And from the experience you shared from Infrastructure Ontario, in awarding businesses on the government side, systems that ensure that, first of all, we know what we want and we're asking for the right specifications, and we have the technical capacity to also appraise any bid and choose the right fit for what we are looking for. So systems on both sides are important. Right. And that, I believe, can be juxtaposed over any industry, that if you have the right systems, you're assured of the right outcomes. The second thing is from your graduating out of school as an architect, and at the time where the market was on a downer. For me, I call it the lemons and lemonade situation, that you decided, okay, well, at this time it's not great, I'm going to go back to school. And then you come back out a second time, and that's when you decided, okay, I think I'm going to go into investment after that. So I think that's fantastic. And then the other thing is also to maintain an open mind when you enter a space. I think that there's been some literature about these parts of the world for everyone, but you came in with an open mind and said, okay, well, I'm going to go over this place and find out what there is. So take the, not the open road, but you can create your own path and go with an open mind. And the other thing that I believe is that we have to come to the point where we have a belief in the people around us. And I think you've mentioned a number of times how you've conferred with your colleagues, and I think that it's never been about just you. And the final thing for me is honesty. That
right.
at least you say where your skills set ends and say, I'm not an expert in this space, but this is my thought, and I appreciate that very much.
That's right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
That's a good summary. I really appreciate the invitation, and I look forward to my multiple visits going forward into the future. So thanks again for the invitation.
Wonderful, Chris, and I look forward to talking to you more on all of those visits.
Thank you.
Great. And for you, our listeners, thank you so much for tuning in. It's another edition just in a moment. Dennis Maynard will be bringing us the news headlines at 2. But as always, I say, go forward, make rain. Shalom, and I think there's only 15 seconds on what I think is one of my favorite songs. It's by Kwame Eugene, and he calls this one Angela. Enjoy.